Hey everybody, John Mark here. Welcome to part 4 of a video series where Kurt Doolittle and I are introducing to you the Second American Constitution, Updated American Constitution, Proprietarian Constitution, whatever we want to call it. In this video, Kurt is going to be talking about a section, or 4 sections actually, as you'll see, that actually come before the Constitution itself, but yet are very, very important, and you're going to see why. And just remember, after this series of 4 introductory videos, Kurt and I are going to be doing future videos where we go more in detail into certain aspects of this Constitution. So let's go to me and Kurt talking about this, and this happens to be, as you'll see, the first part of what we recorded. So I'm going to leave the introduction in there because there's some important aspects there, and then we'll get right into it. I am very excited because I have with me Kurt Doolittle, founder of the Proprietarian Institute, and in my opinion, the most important intellectual alive today. And this is a series of videos where we are going through a second American Constitution, an updated American Constitution. We could call it different things. We could call it a Proprietarian Constitution, a Constitution for America 2.0, but it puts in practice the insights of proprietarianism, which writes down the success strategy of America and Western civilization in scientific and legal language, and it completes the Founding Fathers' vision by putting into practice knowledge we've accumulated over the past decades and even over the last couple of centuries about what to do and what not to do when it comes to rule of law and government. And it undoes a lot of the mistakes that we've made that have led to the myriad of problems that we have today. Not only that, but it provides a solution for the crisis in America and lays a solid foundation for life in America after we come out of this crisis so that our descendants don't have to go through this whole mess again. And as you've heard me say on other videos, if we implement this Constitution, I believe we and our descendants will have a higher quality of life than any group of people in the history of the world have ever experienced. So just a couple of quick pieces of information before I bring Kurt in. You can read this Constitution on proprietarianism.com, and I will also put a link to it in the description of this video and in the top comment. And I would just say from my personal experience, Kurt Doolittle is extremely well read on all the pertinent issues and the books and the research papers around every topic that is included in this Constitution. So I would say give Kurt the benefit of the doubt a little bit if you find something or hear something you don't quite understand or that's a little bit outside the box of your current understanding, because Kurt thinks through things extremely thoroughly, and there's a very good reason for everything that you will find in this Constitution. So Kurt, welcome. Thank you so much for the immense time and effort that you have put into crafting this Constitution. And do you have any initial thoughts that you'd like to share?
I think that, first of all, I want to thank you for the introduction. I always feel undeserved. Thank you.
You're not. I believe you deserve it, and I really appreciate. I really appreciate. I know it's a lot of hard work, Kurt, and I don't know if people realize how much hard work you do, but I, for one, definitely appreciate it. I know there's many, many others that do.
If I had known what this would take, I never would have done it. That's for sure. So let's give people some context. They want a constitution, right? But what does that mean? I mean, in historical terms, the English Constitution was never written down. The British Constitution still isn't. Our ancestors wrote it down, but when they wrote it down, they were working with everything from the English Revolution, right? The Magna Carta, the relatively recent English. Remember, the Puritans are coming because of the English Revolution into America, and they're working from Hobbes and Locke and Smith and Hume, and they're trying to culminate the vast advancement in understanding that they have into a form of government that will function. Now, we've had a couple of 100 years of technological innovation beyond them, and we've been able to see that. So I get a lot of, I want something simple I can understand. And do you think you understand the Constitution as it's written? Because I'll bet I can ask you a couple of questions and say, you'll say that you intuit that what's moral about it. But whether you understand it or not is actually pretty hard to come by, because there's been a lot of abuse to it over time. So I want to put in context that just like when you had the Greeks ran into the problem of scale, in other words, they had practiced a traditional civilization. And as they grew and expanded into an empire, they ran into the problem of having to create this thing called philosophy so they could understand, frankly, what they were doing. And they could modernize, they could articulate what they were doing. Well, we had a similar problem in the Enlightenment, or the scientific Enlightenment, and that was that the British Empirical Revolution came along, and those people were trying to preserve our way of life, just like you and I are trying to preserve our way of life. And that way of life is very old. I mean, it's not, we think of it as the American Constitution, before that the English Constitution, before that the right of the Anglo-Saxons, before that the customary law of the Germanic people, and before that the customary law of the Indo-European people. So our traditional law is unique in the world, and it's incredibly old. So we have to go through this recycle every once in a while, because we get to the point where we've grown enough and enough's changed that we have to update that. And so we've been through generations of it. I don't know what generation I would call what we're doing today, but it's certainly it's certainly as big an innovation as it was for Jefferson and Adams. Mm-hmm. And they would learn. There was a lot that happened there that Jefferson and Adams tried to account for. That's why it's a pretty good constitution.
Yes.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so we're not plucking this out of thin air. You're not plucking this out of thin air. This is an improvement and an innovation, but it is one in a long line of stages, I guess you could say, of our civilization and our law.
Right. And, one of the problems is that neither the Aristotelians nor the British nor the Americans, they got to the point where they understood natural law, but they didn't get to the point where they could produce a formal logic of law. And that's really the problem. In other words, they were never to make law into a science.
And that's what I see from your work, and that so many others see from your work, is it kind of takes what we as Western peoples intuit, as you say, it's like an intuition to us. And when I read, for example, the definition of reciprocity that you've written down, or the falsehood tests, and your writings, I realize this is kind of what I intuit. This is what us grassroots right-wingers, particularly Western peoples, we intuit this. And when I see it written down the way you write it down, I say, this is it. He's describing it in words. And so it is an innovation in that respect.
And so I think that's actually that's the part I actually have a romantic attachment to, is that I set out to create a value neutral language. That's all I wanted to do, is I wanted to create a value neutral language of ethics and politics that Western people could use, conservatives and libertarians, to explain our traditional way of life in rational and scientific terms, because honestly, it didn't exist. And what happened in the 20th century is it got intentionally, deceitfully mangled so that that underlying truth was obscured from us. And so what I've tried to do is put that into a form that isn't possible to screw with any more than the Pythagorean theorem is possible to mess with anymore. It's a very strict model, and I know it's hard for people to imagine that's possible, but while I love getting into the technical weeds, it horrifies or makes us lose people, so I'm going to avoid it. I'm just going to ask people to understand that it's not that I can't or don't know those technical weeds as well as any other logician on the planet. I do. I just find that nobody else cares as much as
We're going to try to keep this accessible, is what we're saying.
So I like to use quantum theory as a great example, is that if you want to hear a little bit about quantum theory, they use a lot of magic-y terms around for what is actually a pretty simple thing for very silly reasons. But you can explain it. But if you try to get into the actual construction of the wave formulas underneath it, it's pretty tedious. Well, the same thing in propertarianism. You don't have to understand how to do that formal logic in order to understand the outcome of it, any more than you need to understand quantum mechanics in order to understand why your iPhone works. You just don't need to know that. It's not necessary. But what I do think people need to know is that it's actually under there.
Yes.
Everything is built on it, and that's why everything's so detailed, is because it's sort of like mathematics. It's actually algorithmic instead of, like mathematics is. It's more like programming, but it's pretty rigid underneath there. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in, Kurt, and say that's a very important point, because a lot of what people will relate to, and you and I have talked about this, a lot of what people will relate to is the policies. They'll see a policy written in the Constitution and they'll say, oh, I get that. I see how that affects my life. But it's important to understand that underlying all of that as a very, very solid, detailed foundation is what is essentially science. It's applying science to the social and political realm. That's the foundation of it.
Yeah. When we say science, we generally mean consistent and correspondent with reality. And when we say logical, we generally mean sets. When we say operational, it means one step follows another. So just like you have sets and arithmetic and mathematics, and you have statistical correlation, in between there is a thing we call operations. And that's what propertarianism is based on. It's an operational logic. In other words, this, follows this, and you can test every step in it. I don't want to go any deeper than this, but we just want to make people understand that if I say it in here, I've written what's equivalent of an operational proof of it, that it's reciprocal.
Yes. And we could call this scientific rule of law or scientific government. Is that fair, Kurt?
Correct. I mean, as long as we understand that scientific in our current sense is not scientific in the old sense. It's more rigid. It means not just rational, not just empirical, but also operational.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, you can follow it step by step, and it's like computer programming. If you have one step that's not in there, or that's missing, or that's wrong, the whole thing doesn't work.
That's how we know a law. That's how we know P-law or proprietarian law is correct or not, or how testimony is correct or not. Because if you can't get from step A to step B, then it can't be true. Anyway,
yes.
We don't want to get people on. We don't want to. I mean, I love this part of it. I mean, it's the part I'm really proud of. It's what people will remember me for, but it's not what people care about.
But I think it's good. We've given the people a good foundation that this is not just us picking policies out of thin air, right? There's an underlying logic, to use kind of normal language to talk about it. There's an underlying science to it, and that's very, very important. And that's why you'll see at the beginning of the Constitution, if you start reading it, there's a lot of definitions. There's a lot of detail put in there to make sure that the foundation is solid.
Right. Okay, so I'll get to that actual issue in a minute. So the reason I said that, look what all they did, all the work the Greeks did, you don't see the work the Romans did, but they did quite a bit of work as well. It tends to mostly be how did they administer using law. That's really where, in other words, the Romans were engineers that applied ideas more so than theorists like the Greeks were. And so you see that there. So I want to make the point that then we get to the British Enlightenment, and there's a lot that goes on there. And so that goes through to the American Constitution. That's sort of the end of it. After that, you have the French and the German and whatever, and those are actually reactions against the Anglo constitutions because they don't like it. And this is the part we have to get over as Europeans is the world doesn't like what we do. So we like what we do because it works for us, but the rest of the world doesn't. Anyway, starting with Darwin, my work is probably the sort of tail end of the Darwinian revolution, if you want to think about it that way. And so there's a lot that's put in here. And so when I say there's a constitution, it's way more than that. So there's really 4 sections. What does it cover? It sort of covers what's the current problem, why are we in the condition we're in, how can we fix it, what benefits do we gain from fixing it, and what are the costs and consequences of fixing it, and frankly, what are the costs if we just go to civil war? And I've tried to answer all those questions, but it's written sort of like a prosecution. The first section is an indictment. It's a sort of overall explanation of the successes of the European people and why we're in this problem today. And for 80% of people, it's enough. That's what's going to put it in ordinary people's language to understand what's happened.
Okay.
Right. The second part is the law, and it's a very technical thing, and it's great for philosophers or libertarians are very skilled at law and economics, so libertarians will probably like it. The third part is the process.
And Kurt, just to say, that's kind of what we were talking about before with the technical aspect of it and all of that, right? That second section. Okay, go ahead. And then the third section?
is the prosecution of the crimes, and this is where it gets very unpleasant. Right? Where I name the enemy, and some of the enemy is our own, some of the enemy is others, and I do a pretty brutal job of slaying sacred cows all around. I wish I didn't have to, but in order to solve the problem once and for all, we have to understand at least what the crimes are, and even if we want to forgive some of them in ourselves, we have to know that they're still crimes.
So this is a portion where it's politically incorrect, which a lot of the grassroots right wing says, well, I don't care about political correctness. But as you say, you slay some sacred cows and you don't really hold back, which is really what we need to do, because we don't want our descendants to go through this again. We want to fix this problem, and that's what's necessary.
I am absolutely positively brutally honest.
Yeah.
Right? It's brutal, and it's not soft stuff. I lay it out. What's the technique, how it's been done, why it works, etc.
Yeah, and it's also important to point out, it's not out of hate, or, I mean, hate is a word that our enemies abuse anyway, but it's not even out of ill will. It's just we can't allow this to happen to us.
Right. I mean, all people develop a strategy. The gypsies have a strategy, right? Their strategy is a sort of organized crime. That's not a pleasant conversation to have. And so, however, to get to that's the only way of explaining why we're in the situation we're in. You brought up an interesting example a minute ago, and that was that it's politically incorrect. But when you understand that the foundation of Western civilization is truth before face, regardless of cost, and that political correctness is an attack on our foundational system, the very secret of the Western civilization, which is they want us to give face before truth, regardless of cost.
Yes.
They're actually attacking the entire basis of Western civilization with political correctness.
Yes, and face before truth, just so people understand, face is you don't want to make people feel bad, or you want to gloss over so that it doesn't offend anybody, that type of thing. Whereas the secret of Western civilization is we're really the only civilization that ever developed. We just speak the truth regardless of how it makes someone feel, and that is such a huge competitive advantage, and that's why Kurt's saying political correctness is actually trying to pull the rug out from underneath that entirely.
So I mean, the system has been evolutionary. How do we create conflict between the classes with Marxism? How do we create it between the genders with feminism? And how do we create conflict between different identities, nonconformity? How do we destroy Western civilization by fomenting discord by the false promise that we're equal?
Yep, that's it.
When the success of Western civilization is that we've always been tripartist, that means that there are classes. So the false promise that we're equal and that there's oppression or hostility going on, when instead we are vastly unequal, and that with markets we can cooperate despite our vast differences and all improve together. And so this is the great, the myth of oppression rather than self-domestication is where this great lie starts, and the false promise that it can be otherwise.
And some people might be saying, well, why does all this need to be in a constitution? Well, it's because we are identifying our really ancient strategy as Western peoples. And Kurt has done a better job of outlining that than anyone I've ever come across. And it's important to outline it because then you know which type of behaviors and practices are against our strategy and against what works well and against natural law, etc. And you know what strategies are in line with our historical strategy and that which works for us and works so well. So this is all very necessary to have some foundation like this in the Constitution.
Well, wait, I want to correct something there. I gave you 4 sections: the indictment, the law, the prosecution, crimes, the judgment, enforcement, but the 5th piece is the Constitution. So yes. This is sort of like the Federalist Papers, right? Right. So these 4 sections are equivalent to the Federalist Papers.
Yes.
Right? Or does that make sense? And
Yes.
so when I started out saying that there's a lot of stuff here, that's what I meant. Just like they had the empirical revolution in the British Enlightenment, we've had the operational revolution. It's just like they had the Federalist Papers and they had Hume, Smith, Locke, and what am I missing? Hobbes. We have, Darwin and Menger and Turing and Doolittle. And so there's a lot here. And so that's when I say, somebody, show me the Constitution. I want something simple. Well, I mean, the Constitution only appears simple because you got this little document in front of you, but you don't have the thousands of pages of argument that went along to be able to produce it by all the thought leaders that went into it.
Yes.
And so when I talk to people, I get kind of frustrated that, well, I understand the Constitution. I'll bet I can ask you 5 questions, so you don't. So
it's laying the foundation and then getting to it's a foundation for the Constitution itself.
Right. So basically, it's laid out like a court case, right? So the indictment, the law, the prosecution, the crimes, the judgment and enforcement, and the Constitution. The Constitution is the remedy. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
All right. So it's written as a prosecution. That's why I said, I mean, we've forgotten to get this across to people, but I used to say it really often that P is really, it's prosecutorial. And what differs between what we normally consider Victorian niceties or Greek and Roman niceties or traditional medieval philosophical and theological niceties is that P isn't like that. It doesn't assume people are good-natured.
P being proprietarianism, yes, it's prosecutorial. It's like going into court and saying, no, you're not allowed to do this, 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 and this.
Right. And so it's not this thing of what people want from me is they want some justificationary moralism like they've had in the past and they're used to without realizing that's the reason they couldn't make a case for conservatism and libertarianism and Western civilization against the left. They couldn't make it because everybody failed. I mean, look at Russell Kirk. He's a catastrophe. These guys write sentimental moralism. Well, it doesn't hold up unless you agree with it intuitively.
Yes.
The problem is not whether you agree with it. It's once you get into an opposition with somebody, how can you decide even though you disagree?
Yes, so it's taking the conservative instinct, we might call it, or the Western civilization instinct, the Western strategy, and taking it the next step beyond just, this feels right to me, and I intuitively want to do this, to now we have it in very specific and precise legal and scientific language, and that can hold up in court.
It can hold up in court, and it also means you can explain. I mean, some people won't like some of the things I help them explain, but you can explain. There's nothing in social science, there's nothing in psychology, sociology, ethics, politics, or group strategy you can't explain in strictly constructed P language. Now, it's non-trivial, like, as you know. I mean, we've got a dozen of us now that are quite good at it and are able to conduct research in it, but it's non-trivial. It's like learning any formal logic or programming method. It's complicated, but you can make those cases in it. And once that happens, then enough of these basic ideas will filter down to ordinary people that they'll say, well, these are the 10 most common arguments we run up against, and these are the most 10 common answers to those arguments. And proprietarianism or testimonialism or whatever you want to call it, or natural law, which we could call it any three of those three things, it will provide people with those explanations.
And hopefully I've been able to get across to people in some of my videos some of the core aspects of it that to me are not really rocket science. The aspect of reciprocity, the definition of reciprocity, that you can intuitively get that when you read it and you say, okay, that makes sense. And so I think at least a good portion of the core of it, or some of the basics, are definitely understandable by the average person.
I think so. I don't expect things to work out the way they do. When I write a proof, that's the answer, right? So, it doesn't really matter what I think. It matters that this is just how it is. And whether we have nonsense in our heads about it or not, we need to do things that way, if we want to retain our civilization.
So that concludes this 4-part introduction to the Proprietarian Constitution. Kurt and I are going to have future videos where we're going through more aspects of this in more detail, and it's going to be absolutely fascinating. There is nothing else more important that you can spend your time on as a grassroots right-winger than this, because as I've said many times, we can talk about the problems all day long, but this provides a solution. Also, make sure you're subscribed to my channel because I'm going to have a video coming out soon called How to Crush the Left Once and for All, where I'm going to talk about the 5 essential elements of a power structure. And I'm going to talk about how this Proprietarian Constitution strengthens each one of those 5 elements so that we, the grassroots right wing, can build a power structure that is somewhere between extremely difficult and impossible for our enemies to break down. So don't miss it. Make sure you're subscribed. Till next time.